The War Council chamber fell silent when the ambassador finished speaking. His words hung in the air like poison. Surrender 3 worlds or face total destruction. The Dominion had conquered 47 species over 3,000 years. They had never lost a single war. Every species that stood against them now existed only in history books. Admiral Eth, the reptilian who commanded the coalition fleet, studied the faces around the massive circular table. Representatives from 11 species sat in their designated seats. With their crystalline bodies reflected the chamber lights. The floated in their water tanks. The wrapped their forearms around themselves in gestures of fear. All of them wore the same expression. Defeat before the first battle had even begun. The numbers were simple and terrible. The fleet numbered over 3,000 warships. The coalition could gather perhaps 1,000. Every military strategist in the room had already calculated the outcome. They would lose. The only question was how many would die before the inevitable surrender. Ambassador X of the rose from her seat. Her crystalline form caught the light as she spoke. She proposed a diplomatic solution. Perhaps they could negotiate. Perhaps they could offer 2 worlds instead of 3. Perhaps they could buy time. The ambassador laughed. It was a horrible sound like bones breaking. His species did not negotiate. They conquered. The coalition had 1 cycle to accept their terms or face annihilation. Captain Daniel Grant had been standing at the back of the chamber. He was there only as an observer. Humanity had joined the coalition just 12 years ago. They were the members, the youngest species. Most of the older races still viewed them as primitive newcomers who had barely discovered faster-than-light travel. Grant stepped forward and requested permission to speak. Admiral Eth hesitated. Protocol demanded that junior species remain silent during High Council meetings, but something in the human's eyes made him curious. He granted permission. Grant walked to the center of the chamber. He was not a tall man. He was not physically impressive. But when he spoke, something in his voice made every being in the room listen. He told them they were thinking about this war the wrong way. They were calculating how to survive battles, how to minimize losses, how to negotiate from a position of weakness. This was why they would lose. The ambassador asked what alternative existed. The numbers were clear. They could not win. Grant smiled. It was not a happy smile. He said humans did not fight to survive battles. They fought to end wars. There was a difference that most species never understood until it was too late. Admiral Eth leaned forward. His reptilian eyes narrowed. He asked Grant to explain. Grant told them about Earth's history. He told them about a war that happened 400 years ago. A coalition of nations faced an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The enemy had conquered most of a continent. They had the largest army. They had momentum and will and belief in their inevitable victory. The coalition did not try to match them battle for battle. They did not try to negotiate. They did not try to survive. Instead, they bombed the enemy's factories. They destroyed their supply lines. They burned their capacity to make war. And when the enemy's military machine ground to a halt, they invaded and did not stop until the enemy's capital was in ruins and their leaders were dead or captured. The war ended not with a negotiated peace, but with total and unconditional surrender. The enemy's ability to wage war was completely destroyed. And for 80 years after, that region knew peace because there was no one left who could restart the conflict. The chamber was silent. The alien representatives stared at Grant with expressions ranging from confusion to horror. Ambassador X asked if Grant was suggesting they attack civilians. Her crystalline face showed disgust. Grant shook his head. He was not suggesting they kill civilians. He was suggesting they destroy the ability to make war, their shipyards, their weapons factories, their supply depots. Without these things, even 3,000 warships became useless. Ships needed fuel. Weapons needed ammunition. Soldiers needed food. The ambassador rose from his seat. His massive form towered over Grant. He called the human a fool. He said that was protected by defenses that no fleet could penetrate. He said Grant had just revealed human stupidity to the entire council. Grant did not step back. He looked up at thee and asked a simple question. Who said anything about attacking the paused? Grant explained. The was heavily defended, but their industrial capacity was not on the. It was spread across 5 moons in their outer system. Moons that had never been attacked because no species had ever dared to enter territory. Moons that were defended by skeleton crews because they could not imagine anyone being bold enough to strike them. Admiral Eth asked how Grant knew this. Grant said human intelligence services had been studying this since first contact. They had mapped every shipyard, every factory, every supply line. They had been preparing for this war for years because humans always prepared for war. It was what they did. The ambassador's expression changed. For the first time, something like uncertainty crossed his alien features. Grant turned to address the full council. He told them he was not asking for coalition support. Humanity would do this alone if necessary, but he wanted them to understand what was about to happen. They had made a mistake that every tyrant in human history had made. They had assumed that because they were strong, they were safe. They had assumed that their enemies would play by their rules. Humans did not play by anyone's rules. Grant looked directly at the ambassador. He told him to send a message home. Tell them that humanity had received their terms. Tell them that humanity's response was not negotiation, not surrender, not defensive preparation. Their response was war, total war. The kind of war that ended not with treaties but with the complete and permanent destruction of the enemy's ability to fight. The ambassador laughed again, but this time there was less certainty in the sound. He called Grant insane. He said humanity had just signed its death warrant. Grant smiled that cold smile again. He said many enemies had told humanity that over the centuries. He asked the ambassador to look around the galaxy and find any of them still standing. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It felt like the moment before a storm. Admiral Eth stood slowly. He said the council would need to deliberate, but he was looking at Grant with new eyes, eyes that held something that had not been there before. It might have been fear, it might have been hope, perhaps it was both. The war had not yet begun, but something had changed in that chamber. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Dominion had encountered something they had never faced before. An enemy that was not afraid of them. An enemy that did not want to survive the war. An enemy that wanted to end it. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, General Cole stood before a room full of military commanders. The bunker had been built 300 years ago to survive nuclear war. Now it served as the beating heart of Earth Defense Command. Screens covered every wall, showing fleet positions, intelligence reports, and the massive red swarm that represented the Armada. General Cole was 62 years old. She had fought in 3 conflicts before this one. She had buried soldiers under her command on 4 different worlds. She understood war better than most humans alive. And she understood that what they were about to do would either save humanity or destroy it completely. She began her briefing by asking a simple question. What made humans different from every other species in the galaxy? The commanders offered various answers: technology, determination, creativity. Cole shook her head. She said other species had those things too. The difference was simpler and more terrible. Humans understood that sometimes peace required absolute victory, not negotiated victory, not partial victory, complete and total annihilation of the enemy's will and ability to fight. She pulled up images from Earth's history. The bombing campaigns of the Second World War, the utter destruction of cities that produced weapons, the systematic dismantling of an enemy's industrial capacity, the demand for unconditional surrender that accepted nothing less than total defeat. These concepts were alien to most species in the galaxy. They fought wars with rules. They fought to gain advantage, to acquire territory, to prove dominance. When the cost became too high, they negotiated. They compromised. They accepted partial defeat and partial victory. Humans did not think this way. When humans went to war, they went to war completely. They did not stop until the enemy could not fight back. This was not cruelty. This was mercy of a strange and terrible kind. A war ended quickly and decisively cost fewer lives than a war that dragged on for generations. 3,000 light-years away, Admiral Eth sat in the observation deck of the Earth vessel Resolute. Captain Grant had invited him aboard as coalition observer. It was a courtesy, but also something more. Grant wanted the Admiral to understand what was about to happen. He wanted at least one alien to carry the truth back to the coalition. Eth watched the human crew work. They moved with quiet efficiency. There was no boasting, no speeches about glory or honor, just calm preparation for what lay ahead. It disturbed him more than he could express. Lieutenant Commander found the Admiral staring out at the stars. She asked if something troubled him. Eth told her that his species had fought 17 wars in their history, All of them had ended in negotiation. Both sides would fight until the cost became unacceptable, then diplomats would gather and divide the spoils. It was civilized. It was rational. Nodded, she said she understood. Then she asked the admiral a question. How many of those 17 wars had stayed finished? Eth did not answer immediately. The truth was uncomfortable. Most of those wars had been fought against the same enemies multiple times. Conflicts that ended with negotiation often restarted a generation later when one side felt strong enough to try again. The cycle had repeated for thousands of years. Said that was why humans fought differently. Earth's history was full of wars that ended with negotiation, and those wars always came back. The same enemies, the same conflicts, the same dead children and the same burned cities. But sometimes humans fought wars that stayed finished. Wars where the enemy was so completely defeated that they could never rise again. Those victories were terrible and costly, but they bought something precious. They bought permanent peace. Eth asked if truly believed they could be defeated permanently. Looked out at the stars. She said she did not know, but she knew that the alternative was worse. They would never stop. They had conquered 47 species. They would conquer 48, then 49, then 100, unless someone stopped them completely. Humans had decided to be that someone. Chief Engineer Leo Barnes interrupted their conversation. He reported that the stealth modifications were complete. The Resolute and 11 other ships were now invisible to sensors. They could slip past any patrol. They could strike any target. Eth asked how this was possible. Coalition technology could not produce such advanced stealth systems. Barnes smiled. He said humans had been building stealth technology for 4 centuries. It started with submarines hiding beneath oceans, then aircraft hiding from radar, then spacecraft hiding from sensors. Humans had a gift for making themselves invisible. It came from being a species of hunters who had spent 100,000 years stalking prey. The fleet departed Earth orbit 3 days later, 12 ships carrying the hope of humanity into enemy territory. They left behind no fanfare, no crowds, no speeches. The mission was secret. Most of humanity would never know what these 12 ships were about to attempt. Sergeant First Class Maria sat in the Marine barracks aboard the Resolute. She was cleaning her weapon for the 4th time that day. It was not necessary, but it gave her hands something to do while her mind raced. She had been a Marine for 15 years. She had fought in border skirmishes, pirate raids, and one full-scale planetary assault, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this. They were going to attack thee in their own territory. They were going to strike at targets that no enemy had ever reached. A young private asked if she was scared. Considered the question honestly. She said yes, she was scared. Only fools were not scared before battle, but she was also confident. Not because she believed they could not die. They absolutely could die. All of them could die. She was confident because she trusted her training. She trusted her fellow Marines. And she trusted that humans had been doing impossible things since they first climbed down from the trees. This was just one more impossible thing. The private asked what made humans so special. Other species were stronger. Others were smarter. Others had been traveling the stars for thousands of years before humans even discovered fire. Thought about it. She said maybe humans were not special at all. Maybe they were just stubborn. Too stubborn to accept defeat. Too stubborn to know when they should surrender. Too stubborn to believe that anything was truly impossible. The galaxy was about to learn what human stubbornness could accomplish. Far ahead of the fleet, in the heart of territory, or received the latest intelligence reports. The humans had made bold threats at the Coalition Council, typical behavior for a primitive species facing annihilation. They would learn soon enough that words meant nothing against warships. He ordered the fleet to continue preparations for the assault on Earth. In 6 weeks, human civilization would be erased from existence. Their species would join the 47 others who had dared to defy dominance. They did not know that 12 human ships were already inside his territory. He did not know that the hunters were already stalking their prey. He would learn soon enough. Everyone would learn. The industrial moon of 7 hung in the darkness of space like a metal tumor. Its surface was covered entirely with factories, refineries, and shipyards. Thousands of workers labored in endless shifts to produce the weapons of conquest. This single moon built more warships each year than the entire coalition fleet combined. Commander Perry watched the moon grow larger on his ship, The Phantom drifted toward it in complete silence. No engines, no emissions, no signals, just the cold momentum of a vessel that had shut down everything except life support and steered using tiny bursts of compressed gas. They had been drifting for 16 hours. 16 hours of silence and darkness and waiting. Perry had fought in special operations for 20 years. He knew how to wait. He knew how to be patient. But even he felt the tension building in his chest as they approached their target. They had never experienced an attack like this. Their species had always been the predators. They had always struck first. The concept of being hunted was so foreign to them that they had not bothered to install proper defensive systems on their industrial facilities. Why would they? No one would dare. Dr. Helen had explained this to Perry during the mission briefing. She was a who had spent her career studying alien minds. The, she said, were victims of their own success. 3,000 years of victory had made them blind. They could not imagine defeat because they had never experienced it. This blindness was their greatest weakness, and tonight humanity would exploit it. Perry gave the signal. Across the system, 11 other human ships received the same command. They had positioned themselves at 5 different targets, industrial moons and orbital shipyards spread across territory, all of them essential to the war machine, all of them undefended. The attack began in perfect silence. Nuclear warheads detached from the human ships and drifted toward their targets on pre-programmed courses. There were no engine flares to detect, no warning signals, just metal death floating through the void. The first explosion lit up the darkness like a new sun. Seven's primary shipyard vanished in a ball of nuclear fire. 3 warships still under construction were vaporized instantly. The shockwave tore through the surrounding factories, triggering secondary explosions that rippled across the moon's surface. Perry watched the destruction with grim satisfaction. He felt no joy. These were not soldiers dying down there. They were workers, builders, but their work produced the weapons that had enslaved 47 species. Their labor kept the war machine running. Without them, that machine would grind to a halt. Similar explosions erupted across territory. 5 industrial moons burned simultaneously. Orbital shipyards broke apart in cascades of fire. Weapons factories collapsed into rubble. Fuel depots detonated with enough force to be visible from neighboring planets. In less than 1 hour, 40% of military production capacity ceased to exist. On the or received the reports with growing disbelief. Attack on 7, attack on the shipyards, attack on the fuel depots attack after attack, spreading across his territory like a plague. His subordinates waited for orders. They had never seen the uncertain before, or had commanded forces for 60 years. He had crushed rebellions and conquered worlds and never once hesitated. But this was different. This was impossible. No enemy had ever penetrated space. No enemy had ever struck at their industrial heart. The very foundations of superiority were crumbling, and he did not know how to respond. He ordered the fleet to return immediately. 3,000 warships began the journey home, but the journey would take weeks, and every day that passed, more facilities burned. The humans were not finished. Commander Perry moved his ship to a new position. The nuclear strikes had been the first phase. Now came the second. Across space, human vessels began broadcasting on all frequencies. The message was simple. It was translated into the language and repeated constantly. It explained that the coalition did not seek genocide. The coalition did not want to destroy the species, but the coalition would not accept subjugation. The coalition would not surrender. The message offered hope to civilians. It told them that this war could end without their extinction, but it also warned them. The military machine was being systematically destroyed. Soon, their fleet would have no shipyards to repair damage, no factories to build new weapons, no fuel depots to keep their engines running. The message invited the people to consider whether their leaders were worth dying for. Doctor had designed this psychological campaign. She understood that they were not monsters. They were a species that had been taught for 3,000 years that they were superior, that they were destined to rule, that other species existed only to serve them. These beliefs could be broken, but not with violence alone. Violence would only create martyrs and fuel resistance. They needed to understand that their beliefs were wrong, that their empire was built on lies, that humanity was offering them something better than endless war. Admiral Eth watched the broadcasts from the Resolute's communication center. He had spent his entire career believing that war was about fleets and weapons and tactical superiority. The humans were showing him something different. They were fighting a war of ideas as much as a war of weapons. They were attacking the belief in their own invincibility. They were demonstrating that strength without wisdom led only to destruction. Captain Grant found the Admiral deep in thought. He asked if Eth understood now. Eth said he was beginning to understand, but he still had questions. The fleet was returning. 3,000 warships would arrive in weeks. How could 12 human ships survive against such overwhelming force? Grant smiled. He said they were not planning to fight the fleet directly. That would be suicide. Instead, they were going to lead the fleet exactly where they wanted it to go. Eth asked where that was. Grant said they were going to lead the into a trap that humanity had been preparing for months, a trap that would end this war once and for all. The Admiral asked how Grant could be so confident. They were desperate now. Desperate enemies were dangerous enemies. Grant nodded. He agreed completely. Desperate enemies were extremely dangerous, but desperation also made them predictable. Desperate enemies made mistakes, and humans had spent their entire history exploiting the mistakes of desperate enemies. They would come for them with everything he had. He would abandon caution. He would ignore his supply lines. He would focus entirely on destroying the human ships that had humiliated him. And that single-minded focus would be his undoing. Eth watched Grant walk away. The human captain moved with the calm confidence of someone who had already won. It was disturbing. It was impressive. And for the first time since this war began, Eth allowed himself to hope. Perhaps these strange, stubborn, terrifying humans knew what they were doing after all. Perhaps they had finally met an enemy they could not defeat. Perhaps the galaxy was about to change forever. Or stood on the bridge of his flagship and watched the stars streak past. His fleet moved at maximum speed, burning fuel reserves that could not be replaced. The human raiders had destroyed the depots. There would be no resupply. But that did not matter. He would catch these humans and tear them apart with his bare claws if necessary. His officers reported that they had tracked the human ships. The tiny fleet was fleeing toward Coalition space. They were fast, but not fast enough. In 3 days, the Armada would catch them. Or smiled for the first time since the attacks began. The humans had been clever. He would admit that. They had struck where no enemy had ever struck before. They had caused damage that would take years to repair. But cleverness meant nothing against overwhelming force. 3,000 warships against 12. The mathematics were simple. The outcome was inevitable. What Orr did not know was that the humans had been counting on him to think exactly that way. Captain Grant watched the fleet's approach on his tactical display. The enemy was moving in a tight formation, all their ships grouped together for maximum firepower. It was an intimidating sight. It was also exactly what he had hoped for. For the past 3 months, while they had been preparing their assault on Earth, humanity had been preparing something else entirely. Coalition ships had seeded a vast region of space with automated weapons platforms. Thousands of missile batteries and rail guns and sensor drones, all hidden among asteroid fields and debris clouds. The fleet was flying directly into the largest ambush in galactic history. Lieutenant Commander ran final checks on the tactical systems. Everything was ready. The weapons platforms were armed. The targeting computers were synchronized. All that remained was to lead into the kill zone. She thought about the lives that were about to end. Thousands of soldiers who were simply following orders, who had families waiting for them back home, who probably believed they were fighting for something good. War was ugly, had accepted that truth long ago, but she also knew that peace required sacrifice. They would never stop unless someone stopped them, and sometimes stopping an enemy meant destroying them so completely that they could never threaten anyone again. Grant gave the order. The human ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the kill zone. They appeared to be trapped. Behind them was the weapons field. In front of them was the Armada. Or saw the human ships and felt triumph surge through him. Finally, after weeks of chasing shadows and watching his empire's industrial capacity burn, he would have his revenge. He ordered the fleet to attack. 3,000 warships accelerated toward 12 human vessels. It should have been a slaughter. It should have been over in minutes. The first wave of ships crossed into the kill zone. And then space itself seemed to explode. Missiles erupted from hidden platforms among the asteroids. Railgun rounds tore through ship hulls at relativistic speeds. Sensor drones coordinated targeting data, ensuring that every shot found its mark. Warships died by the dozens in the first seconds. Their formations broke apart as captains tried to evade the incoming fire. But there was nowhere to hide. The weapons were everywhere. The ambush was perfect. Or screamed orders that no one could follow. His flagship shuddered as missiles impacted against its shields. Warning alarms filled the bridge with noise. Damage reports flooded in faster than anyone could read them. The had walked into a trap, and now he understood too late that the humans had never been running. They had been leading him exactly where they wanted him. While the fleet burned, something else was happening far away. Sergeant Maria dropped from the sky in a combat pod. Around her, 50 other Marines plummeted toward the surface of the. Their mission was surgical, precise. They were not here to kill civilians. They were here to capture the leadership. The pod slammed into the ground near the government complex, was moving before the dust settled. Her squad formed up around her and advanced toward the main building. Guards tried to stop them. They were brave, they fought hard, but human Marines had trained for exactly this kind of operation. Close quarters combat, building clearance, capture of high-value targets. The guards fell one by one. Found the Supreme Council huddled in their chambers. 12 leaders who had ordered the conquest of 47 species. 12 beings who had believed themselves untouchable. They stared at the human soldiers with expressions of pure disbelief. Told them they were under arrest. The war was over. They would face justice for their crimes. One of the council members, an old with scales, asked how this was possible. How had humans defeated the greatest military power in the galaxy? Considered the question. She said humans had not done anything special. They had simply refused to accept defeat. They had studied their enemy, found their weaknesses, exploited those weaknesses without mercy. They had believed they were invincible. That belief had made them blind, and blindness in war meant death. Back in space, the battle was ending. Half the fleet had been destroyed. The rest were scattered, many damaged beyond repair. Or's flagship drifted without power, its engines destroyed and its hull breached in a dozen places. Captain Grant ordered the surviving ships to surrender. He told them their leadership had been captured. Their industrial capacity had been destroyed. Their fleet was crippled. The war was over. Or heard the message from his broken bridge. Around him, the bodies of his officers lay where they had fallen. He was injured, bleeding from wounds he did not remember receiving. He had commanded forces for 60 years. He had never lost a battle. He had believed, truly believed, that his species was destined to rule the galaxy. And now a species that had been traveling the stars for less than 2 centuries had humiliated him completely. He asked for terms of surrender. Grant's response was simple, unconditional, total. They would surrender everything, their weapons, their territory, their very form of government. In return, they would receive their lives and the chance to rebuild as something better. Or wanted to refuse. He wanted to fight to the death, but he looked at the shattered remnants of his fleet and understood that fighting would accomplish nothing except more death. He accepted the terms. Admiral Eth stood on the bridge of the Resolute and watched the ships power down their weapons. He had witnessed something that would change the galaxy forever. A species that had terrorized the stars for 3,000 years had been broken in a matter of weeks. He asked Grant how he felt. Grant was silent for a long moment. Then he said he felt tired and sad. Many beings had died today, and human alike. War was never something to celebrate, even when it was necessary. But he also felt hope, because they would no longer threaten anyone, because billions of beings across the galaxy could sleep safely tonight, because sometimes peace required terrible sacrifice, and humans had been willing to make that sacrifice. Eth understood. These humans were not monsters. They were not conquerors. They were simply a species that refused to accept tyranny, a species willing to do whatever was necessary to protect the innocent. The galaxy had learned a valuable lesson today. Humanity did not just fight battles. They ended wars. 3 months had passed since the surrender. The galaxy was still adjusting to the new reality. An empire that had stood for 3,000 years had fallen in a matter of weeks. Species that had lived in fear for generations were learning what freedom felt like. Admiral Daniel Grant, newly promoted, stood at the window of Coalition headquarters and watched ships from a dozen species pass by. The organization had changed since the war. It was stronger now, more unified. The threat of the had brought the member species together in ways that centuries of diplomacy had failed to accomplish. Lieutenant Commander found him there. She had received her own promotion and now served as lead instructor at the Coalition Military Academy. Her job was to teach alien officers the principles of human warfare. It was challenging work. Most species still struggled to understand how humans thought about conflict. She told Grant that a new class of students had arrived. Representatives from 8 species, all eager to learn from the beings who had defeated the undefeatable. Grant nodded. He said teaching was good. Understanding was better than fear. If other species understood how humans fought, they would be less likely to become enemies. Asked if Grant thought there would be more wars. Grant said there would always be more wars. That was the nature of intelligent life. Resources were limited. Ambitions were not. Conflict was inevitable. But perhaps the next war would end faster. Perhaps fewer lives would be lost. Perhaps the lessons of this conflict would prevent the next one from becoming another 3,000-year nightmare. That was worth hopping for. Far away, on a planet that had been designated New Harmony, something remarkable was happening. Human administrators worked alongside civilians to rebuild their shattered society. It was not easy. There was resentment on both sides. They had lost everything they believed in. The humans had lost friends and family in the war. But slowly, carefully, trust was beginning to form. Sergeant Maria had volunteered for the reconstruction mission. She had spent her career destroying things. Now she wanted to try building something instead. She supervised a construction project in what had once been a military barracks. Workers, former soldiers mostly, labored beside human engineers to transform the structure into a school. The first school where human children would learn together. One of the workers approached her during a break. He was young, barely an adult by standards. He asked why humans were helping them. His people had tried to destroy humanity. They had threatened to erase human civilization from existence. Why would humans respond with kindness? Thought carefully before answering. She said humans did not help them because they had forgiven them. Forgiveness would take time, maybe generations. Humans helped because they understood something important. Enemies who were destroyed completely became martyrs. Enemies who were humiliated became vengeful. But enemies who were defeated and then helped to rebuild became something else entirely. They became allies. The young did not fully understand. His culture had no concept of this kind of thinking. Victory had always meant dominance. Defeat had always meant subjugation. Said he would learn. They all would learn. That was the point of building schools. On the former Supreme Council awaited trial. Human judges would preside, but the proceedings would follow coalition law. It was important that justice be seen as fair. Vengeance would only plant seeds for future conflict. The trials would last months. Evidence would be presented. Crimes would be documented. And in the end, those responsible for the suffering of 47 species would face consequences proportional to their actions. Not death. Humans had learned long ago that executing leaders created martyrs. Instead, the council members would spend the rest of their lives helping to repair the damage they had caused. They would work alongside the species they had conquered. They would see firsthand the suffering their empire had inflicted. For beings who had believed themselves gods, this fate was worse than execution. Admiral Eth had returned to his as a hero. The who had witnessed humanity's victory firsthand was now the most famous member of his species. He had been offered positions of power and influence. He had refused them all. Instead, he had returned to his first love, scholarship. He was writing a book about the war, not a military analysis, though that would come later. This first book was something different. It was an attempt to explain human psychology to the rest of the galaxy, to help other species understand how and why humans fought the way they did. The title had been difficult to choose. He had considered dozens of options before settling on something simple. Why Humans Win, a study of necessary victory. The central argument was one that still troubled him. Humans did not fight to survive. They did not fight to gain advantage. They fought to end conflicts permanently. This required a willingness to commit fully to war in ways that other species found disturbing. But it also required something else, something that had surprised Eth deeply. Humans understood that true victory required more than military success. Destroying an enemy was only the first step. The second step was rebuilding that enemy into something better. This was why humans were helping not because they had forgiven, not because they were weak, but because they understood that peace required more than the absence of war. Peace required former enemies becoming friends. The final chapter of Eth's book focused on the future. He predicted that humanity would continue to rise in galactic importance, not because they sought power, but because other species would seek their protection. A species that could defeat anyone. A species that helped rebuild fallen enemies could be trusted. A species that fought to end wars rather than prolong them was a species worth following. The galaxy was changing. Humanity was changing it, and Eth truly believed that the changes would be for the better. On New Harmony, the school was complete. Maria stood at the entrance as the first students arrived. Children walked alongside human children. They were nervous, uncertain, looking at each other with curiosity and suspicion. A human girl, no more than 7 years old, approached a child of similar age. She held out her hand in the human gesture of greeting. The child did not know what to do. His people did not shake hands, but something in the human girl's smile made him extend his own clawed hand. They stood there for a moment, two children from species that had nearly destroyed each other, holding hands. Watched and felt something loosen in her chest, something she had been carrying since the war began. This was why they fought, not for glory, not for conquest, not even for survival. They fought so that moments like this could exist, so that children who might have been enemies could instead become friends, so that the cycle of violence that had consumed the galaxy for thousands of years could finally break. Humanity did not just fight battles, they did not just win wars. They built peace from the ashes of conflict. And that, more than any weapon or strategy or military doctrine, was what made them truly dangerous. Because peace, once built, was worth defending. And humans would defend it with everything they had. Forever,